You knew. You stayed anyway. Not because you were blind, not because you missed the signs, not because you were naive or desperate or broken in some way that made you incapable of seeing clearly. You saw, you cataloged, you felt the specific discomfort of knowing something you weren't ready to act on, and you stayed anyway. That is not weakness. That is something far more precise and far more difficult to face, because the comfortable story, the one you've been telling yourself and the one everyone around you reinforced, is that you didn't see, that the flags were hidden, that you were deceived. That story is clean. It makes you the victim of someone else's concealment rather than the architect of your own willful blindness. It lets you off the hook, and it is almost entirely false. You saw the flag the first time they dismissed something that mattered to you, and you called it a bad day. You saw it when the story they told about their ex had no complexity, no shared responsibility, no version of events where they carried any of the weight, and you called it baggage. You saw it in the way they spoke to someone they felt superior to, in the way their energy shifted when they didn't get what they wanted, in the way a certain kind of silence felt like punishment without a word being spoken. You saw all of it, in real time, with perfect clarity. And then, you did the thing that humans do when what they see threatens something they need. You looked somewhere else, not consciously. That's the part no one explains. The looking away was not a decision you made at a table with full information. It happened faster than thought. It happened in the half-second between perception and interpretation, in the gap where the brain takes what the eyes deliver and decides what category it belongs to. And your brain, trained by years of its own history, its own early lessons about what love looks like and what it costs and what you have to tolerate to keep it, your brain filed the flag under exception, under context, under he's going through something, and she doesn't always mean it like that, and I'm probably being too sensitive. That filing system was not built by this relationship. It was built long before you ever met this person. It was constructed in rooms you barely remember, by dynamics you absorbed before you had the language to name them. Jung called it the complex, the invisible architecture of belief and feeling organized around an early wound, so foundational that it stops being something you have and becomes something you see through. You don't see the complex, you see the world through it, and the world it shows you is one where certain behaviors are normal, certain treatment is acceptable, certain flags are not flags at all, just the texture of love as you have always known it. That is why you stayed. Not because you were weak, because the flag didn't register as a flag. It registered as familiar, and familiar, to a nervous system shaped by early attachment, feels indistinguishable from safe. This is the thing that changes everything. You were not fooled by them. You were fooled by the gap between what you saw and what you were able to believe about what you saw. Two entirely different failures. One lives in their behavior, the other lives in you, in the interpretive system you inherited before you were old enough to question it. And that system, until it is seen and named and examined, will continue. Not because you are doomed, because you are human, because every human being navigates the present through the map drawn by the past. And maps that were never updated keep directing you toward terrain that no longer exists. You saw the red flags, every single one. The question was never whether you could see. The question, the one that cuts deeper, the one that this text is actually about, is why seeing was never enough to make you leave. That answer is not simple, but it exists, and it begins exactly where you are now. You remember the exact moment you saw the first one, not a vague feeling, not a general unease, a specific moment, a specific thing they said, or didn't say, a specific look on their face when they thought you weren't watching, a specific silence that lasted 3 seconds too long and told you everything you weren't ready to hear. You remember where you were, you remember what you were wearing, you remember the feeling in your chest, not quite pain, not quite fear, something quieter than both, a knowing that arrived without invitation and refused to leave completely, even after you explained it away. You explained it away immediately. You were good at that. You'd been practicing for years without knowing it. And here's the part that no one talks about. The part that happens after the flag and before the excuse. That fraction of a second where you just knew. Before the rationalization. Before the reframing. Before your mind arrived with its list of reasons why it probably meant something else. In that fraction of a second, you were completely clear. You saw exactly what it was, and some part of you, the oldest, quietest part, filed it away. Not to act on, just to keep. That part of you has been keeping everything. You know what I'm talking about? The file that exists somewhere beneath the surface of the relationship you constructed around this person. The file that contains every moment of clarity you ever had and immediately talked yourself out of. The way they spoke about money when they were stressed. The way they reacted the first time you set a boundary. That specific look, that specific energy shift, that specific version of them that appeared for just a moment before the performance resumed. The night you felt completely alone in a room you were sharing with them and said nothing because saying something felt more dangerous than staying silent. You stayed silent, you stayed, and in the morning, you reset. Because that's what you do. Because resetting is how you survived. Not this relationship, but everything that came before it. You learned early that the cost of seeing clearly was too high. That naming what you saw created conflict. That conflict threatened connection. And connection, even imperfect connection, even connection that cost you pieces of yourself, felt necessary in a way that had nothing to do with this person and everything to do with what you learned. Love was before you were old enough to choose differently. So you became an expert at the reset, at waking up and letting the previous night be smaller than it was, at finding the version of them that confirmed what you needed to believe and holding on to that version when the other one appeared, at telling yourself the story of the relationship's best moments so fluently that the other moments began to feel like interruptions rather than information. They were information. They were always information. But information only changes behavior when the person receiving it believes they deserve better than what the information is describing. And somewhere beneath the relationship, beneath the reset, beneath the expert-level rationalization, there was a belief you hadn't examined, a quiet, foundational, never-spoken belief that this was approximately what you were worth, that people who saw more clearly than you got better things, that the flags were just the price of admission to a love that someone like you could realistically expect. You never said that. Not out loud, not even to yourself, not in those words. But it was operating. Every time you stayed, every time you reset, every time you took what you saw and filed it somewhere, it couldn't require anything of you. That belief is not the truth, but it was your truth, inherited, unexamined, running silently beneath every choice you made in that relationship. And the reason you're reading this, the reason something in you recognized itself in the first line, is because some part of you already knows that. The same part that kept the file, the same part that saw clearly in that fraction of a second before the excuses arrived. That part has been waiting for permission to speak. It's speaking now. It wasn't a coincidence. None of it was ever a coincidence. Not the person you chose, not the dynamic you built, not the specific way the flags appeared, in exactly the register you had been trained, long before this relationship, to tolerate. Not the fact that when you replay the relationship honestly, you can see that the flags were never hidden. They were offered early, openly, consistently, and you received them in the only way your system knew how to receive them. You called it love. It was recognition. And recognition, the nervous system's deep, pre-conscious signal that says, I know this territory, I know the rules of this place, feels identical to love when you have never known the difference. The racing heart, the intensity, the feeling of being completely seen by someone who actually, you will later understand, was simply activating something ancient in you. Something that existed long before their name. You didn't choose badly. You chose precisely. You saw the coldness. You called it complexity. You saw the control. You called it passion. You saw the dismissal. You called it honesty. You saw the pattern. You called it a phase. Every flag was translated in real time, automatically, with a fluency that took years to develop and a lifetime of early lessons to install. The translation wasn't conscious. You didn't sit down and decide to reframe what you saw. The reframing happened before the seeing was even complete. Before the perception finished forming, the interpretive system was already filing it somewhere safe, somewhere that didn't require action, somewhere that allowed everything to continue. That system was not built by this relationship. It was built in the first relationships you ever had, the ones where you had no choice but to adapt, where love came with conditions that were never written down, but were always understood, where certain versions of you were welcome and certain versions were not, where you learned, without words, without anyone explaining it, that seeing clearly was dangerous, that naming what you saw created rupture, that rupture meant loss, and loss at that age, in that context, felt unsurvivable. So you stopped naming, you started translating, and the translation became so automatic, so invisible, so constitutive of how you moved through the world, that by the time you met this person, you had no idea it was happening. It wasn't that you couldn't see the flags, it was that your system had no category for what seeing them would require. It wasn't that you didn't know something was wrong, it was that knowing had never been enough to make you leave anything before. It wasn't that you chose someone who hid who they were, it was that you chose someone whose particular way of being difficult matched the particular way you had learned to make yourself smaller. That match felt like destiny. It was a wound recognizing its reflection. Jung called this the repetition compulsion. The unconscious drive to recreate the unresolved, to return to the emotional scene of the original injury and attempt, this time, to get a different ending. You didn't choose this person because they were good for you. You chose them because they gave you the chance to finally, this time, be enough. To finally be chosen fully, to finally resolve the question that has been running since before you can remember. Am I worth staying for? That question is not about them. It was never about them. They were the latest stage for a drama that predates them entirely, and the flags, every single one, were not obstacles to the relationship. They were the relationship. The specific texture of the unresolved wound playing itself out again, in a new context, with a new face, at a higher cost. You stayed because leaving felt like proof. Proof that the answer to the question was no. You stayed because staying felt like hope. Hope that this time, the ending would be different. It wasn't different. It never is. Not until the question itself is answered from the inside. That question cannot be answered by another person. It has never been answerable by another person. Every relationship you entered hoping they would answer it ended with the same result, because you were asking the wrong source. The answer lives in you. It has always lived in you, but reaching it requires something most people spend their entire lives avoiding: seeing the flag and believing you deserve better than what it's telling you. Not someday, not after more evidence. Now, in the fraction of a second before the translation begins. That fraction of a second is the whole thing. This is the part where most people expect permission. Permission to leave, permission to stop explaining, permission to stop carrying the weight of a relationship they knew from the beginning was costing them more than it was giving. Permission to finally believe that what they saw was real, that the flags were flags, that the discomfort was data, that the knowing they suppressed for months or years was accurate all along. You don't need permission, but you do need something harder. You need to understand why the leaving was never the problem, why walking out the door, even when you finally did, even when the relationship ended, doesn't automatically end the pattern. Why people who leave one red flag relationship find themselves, 18 months later, inside another one that feels completely different on the surface and is structurally identical beneath it. Leaving is not the work. Leaving is just the beginning of the work. The work is this: understanding what you were actually looking for in that relationship. Not love. Everyone says love. Beneath love, the specific thing you needed that person to give you that you have never been able to give yourself. The validation, the proof, the answer to the question that has been running since long before you met them. Because until that need is named, fully, honestly, without the comfortable story that makes you the victim and them the villain, it will continue to direct, silently, toward the next person who offers the familiar ache that your nervous system has learned to read as home. Jung was precise about what happens when the unconscious is not made conscious. It doesn't disappear. It doesn't weaken with time. It manifests in your choices, in your patterns, in the specific type of person you find compelling in a room full of people. The wound that was never examined becomes the compass, and a compass set to an old injury will navigate you with devastating accuracy directly toward its repetition. You have felt that accuracy. You have stood in a new relationship, months in, and felt the floor shift beneath you in a way that was familiar. Not familiar like comfort, familiar like a country you swore you'd left, but somehow keep finding yourself back inside. The landmark's different, the feeling identical. That feeling is information, the most precise information available. It is the unconscious showing you, in real time, that the old pattern is active, that the wound is running the navigation again, that without intervention, real intervention, not the kind that looks like growth from the outside, but leaves the interior architecture untouched, you are going to arrive at the same destination wearing different shoes. The intervention is not leaving faster next time. It is not building higher walls or trusting less or becoming someone who no longer needs connection. Those are not solutions. They are the wound dressed as wisdom. The intervention is contact, direct, uncomfortable, sustained contact with the original question. Not why did they treat me that way? That question keeps the focus external, keeps you waiting for someone else's behavior to change before your life can. The real question, the one underneath. What did I believe about myself that made their treatment feel like something I should accept? What did I learn early about what I was worth and what love costs? Where did I first understand that certain versions of me were too much or not enough, or required editing before they could be safely offered to another person? Those questions are not comfortable. They don't resolve in a single sitting. They require the willingness to sit with what they reveal without immediately reaching for a reframe, a distraction, or a new relationship that temporarily quiets the noise. But they are the only questions that actually change anything. Because the pattern doesn't live in the people you choose. It lives in the chooser, and the chooser, you, is the only variable in this equation that you have any power over. You saw the red flags, every single one, from the beginning. Now you are seeing something harder, something that requires more courage than leaving ever did. You are seeing yourself, clearly, perhaps for the first time, and that, only that, is where it ends.